why? Why was this incredible destruction, this awful toll in lives and human misery allowed to happen? What went wrong? What were the causes that triggered off the appalling Holocaust that we describe as the Second World War? The causes of the war were many and varied, but most of them were spawned by the First World War. The victorious Allied troops had fought in the hope that this was to be the war that would end wars. But when it was all over, the statesmen went to discuss the peace treaty at Versailles, armed only with 19th century prejudices. The idealism of President Woodrow Wilson would soon be shattered by the harsh practicalities of his European partners. They were determined that never again would the Germans have the opportunity of ravaging France. The treaty dismembered Germany and its allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. These large and powerful states were to be broken up so that the various ethnic groups they contained would have their own separate countries. Unfortunately, however, this checkerboard of small independent nations would prove to be too weak to defend itself against an embittered and vengeance-seeking Germany. Instead of healing old wounds, the Treaty of Versailles only succeeded in creating a new discontent. More drastic solutions would soon replace the fumbling of the diplomats. All over Europe, the old order was changing. In war-torn Russia, Tsar Nicholas had been forced to abdicate. His ill-equipped army had faced constant defeat at the hands of the Germans, and now there was wholesale mutiny. They'd had enough of fighting and were going home. But at home, the country was gripped by hunger, and there were food riots. The Bolsheviks, capitalizing on the unrest and promising land to the peasants, seized power with the help of the disgruntled and mutinous army. A military dictatorship was established under Nikolai Lenin, and private land and industry would now be owned by the state. Lenin called for an international communist revolution, urging workers everywhere to overthrow their governments and sweep away the rotten world of Western capitalism. In Italy, the dismal poverty of the peasants, the corruption of its politicians, and the desire of its people to renew the glories of the past were exploited by the fascists of one Benito Mussolini. Another totalitarian state was in the making. Germany, economically ruined by the huge war reparations demanded by the Allies, was ripe for extremist solutions. Ruinous inflation, mass unemployment, and hunger touched off rivals. Humiliated by the defeat in war, embittered by the treaty, yet still suffering from delusions of grandeur, the Germans now found an outlet for their shame and anger in an emotionally unstable ex-corporal named Adolf Hitler. He was the leader, the Führer of the National Socialist Party, and the lies and perversions of his Nazi doctrine found an eloquent spokesman in Dr. Joseph Goebbels. For a nation that was torn by social revolution and haunted by the specter of communism, Hitler had solutions. He would unite all Germans everywhere into a strong new Reich. Jews and communists would be outlawed, and the Treaty of Versailles repudiated. All over Europe, democracy was being challenged by the demagogues.
But in America, the people, sick of war and suspicious of European politics, deliberately turn their backs and try to isolate themselves from the international scene. Wilson returns from Versailles to face bitter opposition. Dare we reject this treaty and break the heart of the world, he asks. But his plea is ignored, and the Senate refuses to ratify the treaty which embodies Wilson's dream of a League of Nations. No more European entanglements is the cry, but it strikes a severe blow at the League, an organization whose aim is the preservation of world peace. Disillusioned by the outcome of the war, Americans are more concerned with Babe Ruth's latest triumph than the fate of the League of Nations. A new dance craze sweeps the nation. And 4.5 million bigots join the Ku Klux Klan. One refreshing incident. A young male pilot tries to fly the Atlantic alone. When he touches down in Paris, the world goes wild with excitement and relief. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, America's ambassador of the air. But back home, it's business as usual. Everyone is buying stocks and the market is booming. Even Germany experiences a fresh burst of prosperity. And Hitler is almost forgotten. Heavy war reparations are still being collected, but she is able to pay her debts from the even larger sums of money being lent her by the United States. Such is the economic absurdity of the times. And every day the stock market climbs to new heights. Some feel that stock prices have reached a precarious position, but who's going to pay attention to reason at a time like this? They try to outlaw war by treaties and prohibit liquor by passing a bill. Neither measure is very successful. And then it's October of 1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression. A financial panic grips the world. For the majority, it means the interminable line outside factory gates, desperately hoping for a job that rarely comes. It means hunger and the march of the unemployed in the nation's capital. With acute domestic problems, America would now isolate herself more than ever from the international scene. It started in America, but practically overnight an economic blizzard swept the world. In Japan, France, Britain, always the unemployed, the soup kitchens, the grinding poverty, and the despair.
To the Nazis, the Depression was a source of great satisfaction. Hitler had built an intricate political organization and a private army of stormtroopers dedicated to violence, terror, and Adolf Hitler. Now the Nazi movement grew fat on the wholesale unemployment and discontent. Germany will be revenged, he ranted. A new and greater Reich will rise from the ashes. Every German will have a job and bread. And the hopeless and hungry masses responded. In the 1930 election, they did well. By 1932, the German people gave the Nazis enough votes to make them the largest party in the nation. In the evening, the people's willpower more easily succumbs to the dominating force of a stronger will, said Hitler. Deterred by the failure of German democracy, supported by the selfish interests of the army and big business, Hitler's star rose, and the aging President Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly and ruthlessly to crush all opposition. Into the far went the books of so-called anti-German writers. He told the newspapers what to print and what to leave out. He persecuted the churches and began his terrible campaign against the Jews. With the terror of the Gestapo and the concentration camps, he liquidated his political opposition. Surrounded by fanatical henchmen like Hermann Goering, the ex-corporal legislated by decree. Now there was only one law in the Third Reich, a state in which the life and liberty of every German were in the hands of one man, the Führer.
Japan's answer to the economic blizzard of the Depression was war. First, an invasion of Manchuria, and then China. Japan had few natural resources and a rapidly increasing population. She determined to take the raw materials and living space that she wanted by force. Western reaction was disheartening. The League of Nations protested and President Hoover applied meaningless moral sanctions. Not surprisingly, the Japanese ignored both the League and Hoover. The campaign went well, and the militarists became the controlling factor in Japanese politics. As usual, it was the ordinary people who paid the price. The orgy of burning, looting, and mass murder which accompanied the Japanese onslaught aroused anger and sympathy in the democracies, but no action. This bloody war would drag on for 13 bitter years, and through it all moved the refugees. But the very poor and the helpless remained, too frightened or too helpless even to move. Mussolini, now solidly entrenched as the fascist dictator of Italy, felt, just as the Japanese had, that a smashing foreign conquest was needed to take Italian minds off the high prices, unemployment, and political oppression. His dream was of a new Roman Empire. Sandwiched between the Italian colonies of Eritrea and Italian Somaliland lay Ethiopia. It was poor and backward, but it was rich in raw materials. To Geneva and the League of Nations came Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. He told them, should it happen that a strong nation may with impunity destroy a small people, the West will perish. But the Western democracies turned a deaf ear to his appeal. And the Italians invaded from north and south. The drums of war beat out, and the barbaric natives rallied to the King of Kings. Mussolini had roared that it was Italy's fascist duty to civilize these backward savages who owned slaves. Against the spears of Sulassi's cavalry, the Roman legions brought the civilizing influence of armor plate, flamethrowers, high explosives, and mustard gas. Mussolini's son-in-law and his two sons took part in the bombing. Vittorio wrote, "One group of horsemen gave me the impression of a budding rose unfolding as the bomb fell in their midst and blew them up." It was most entertaining. In 6 months, it was all over. Once again, Britain, France, and the United States had stood aside. They had only paved the way for what was to come.
Encouraged by Mussolini's Ethiopian adventure, Hitler now turned to his main concern, foreign affairs. His slogan, world power or ruin. Amid the barbaric spectacle of Nuremberg, he moved the masses into an emotional frenzy.
Drei Monate begangen sind, die es alle Terror bis Jahrhunderte während der Garten.
Blatantly ignoring the Versailles Treaty, he ordered military conscription to build up the Wehrmacht. To start with, they only had shovels, but they were well trained, and there was no more unemployment. Heavy industry turned out the implements of war. The industrialists were getting paid off for their support, and the shovels soon turned into rifles. Hitler was ready to make his first move, and the German people looked on approvingly. To offer France some protection from German invasion, the Treaty of Versailles had created a demilitarized zone of German territory along the Rhine. Now, Hitler determined to restore Germany's sovereignty. Only 2 hours after proposing a peace pact with Britain and France, he sent in troops to occupy the Rhineland. They were greeted with cheers and flowers by the German population. They had orders to withdraw should the French take countermeasures. The French did send some tanks to the border, but that was all. Hitler had gambled and won. Now he could afford to soothe Allied nerves. "We have no territorial demands to make in Europe," he said. "Germany will never break the peace." With that, he proceeded to fortify the Rhineland. Once having secured his western border, he could start his drive towards the east and the black soil of the Ukraine. Munitions plants worked night and day, and the whole nation paid tribute to the god of war. In the face of Hitler's rearmament and his announced intention to conquer the world, why didn't the democracies act to curb Germany's menace to the peace? Unfortunately, it was this very desire for peace which more than anything stayed their hands. They were sick of war, and still plagued by economic depression and unemployment, they were unwilling to face the enormous cost of rearming. A new war was the last thing they wanted. They had another fear. Lloyd George had said, "Germany is the bulwark against communism in Europe. If her defense breaks down, Europe will follow. Do not let us be in a hurry to condemn Germany."
In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini went into partnership and formed the Rome-Berlin Axis. In the same year, they joined forces to aid another fascist, this one a Spaniard, His name, Franco. Franco's aim was the overthrow of the democratic Spanish government, a government that was trying to overcome the poverty and illiteracy of the people. Hitler and Mussolini sent troops, planes, tanks, and guns to his aid. They used Spain as a training ground to combat test their men and weapons. This savage civil war was to drag on for 2.5 murderous years. The democracies, always afraid of war, refused to help the Republican government in its fight against fascism. But where they failed, the communists stepped in and sent arms. Soon, Spain became the battleground of two imperialisms. Faced with fascist brutality from without and communist treachery and terrorism from within, the Democratic Republicans lost to both.
In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. The German columns moved unhindered on Vienna. It has been estimated that probably half the Austrians regarded Anschluss with their strong neighbor as a blessing, at least to start with. Welcomed by enthusiastic crowds, the Führer returned to his homeland. He had left Vienna as a vagabond. He returned a conquering hero, the leader of his people. Without a shot having been fired, Austria had become a German province, and Hitler's power and prestige soared at home and abroad. Now that he had Austria, Hitler's next victim, Czechoslovakia, was hemmed in on three sides. Over 3 million Germans populated a region of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. They were to provide the Führer with an excuse for his next act of aggression. The Nazi Party rallied at Nuremberg, and Hitler demanded Sudeten self-determination, which in effect meant its occupation by the Third Reich. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany, and Hitler told him, "This is the last territorial demand I have to make in Europe." To start with terms. Deserted by their own allies, the Czechs were forced to acquiesce. Hitler and his cronies could afford to look pleased. Chamberlain declared, "This is the second time there has come back from Germany peace with honor. I believe it is peace in our time." What was so honorable about selling one's ally to the Germans was not explained. And Winston Churchill remarked, "We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat." On October the 1st, 1938, German armies marched into an unresisting Sudetenland. 4 months later, having completely duped Chamberlain, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Sold out by its allies, one of the strongest states in Europe was no more. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary reduced to a Nazi satellite. Hitler was now in control of the vital heartland of Europe and in a strategic position to dominate the continent.
Russian offers to help stem the tide of German aggression having been ignored, the Soviets lost patience with the Allies and decided to protect themselves for as long as possible. Accordingly, in August 1939, they signed a cynical non-aggression pact with Germany. One of the provisos, that Russia would not interfere with a German invasion of Poland. Stalin's price for remaining neutral, Eastern Poland. Hitler was now free to act, and Poland's doom was sealed.
On September 1st, 1939, the weather perfect for mechanized warfare, Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg. Our strength is in our quickness and in our brutality, he screamed. Be hard, be without mercy. Having guaranteed Polish boundaries, Britain and France were now forced into war. They would soon pay heavily for their past mistakes, their fears, and their selfishness. President Beneš of Czechoslovakia had said, "Freedom will never belong to those who will not die for it." A black stain had been allowed to spread across Europe. To eradicate it, men would have to fight. To preserve their freedom, men would have to die.